Something happened in Washington this week that we haven't seen in this presidency. Republicans broke with Donald Trump. Not quietly, not behind closed doors. On the floor of the United States House of Representatives, 6 Republican lawmakers crossed the aisle, joined Democrats, and voted to repeal the president's tariffs on Canada. And while that was happening, Trump was on Truth Social threatening every Republican who dared vote against him. His exact words, "Any Republican in the House or the Senate that votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries." They voted anyway. So today we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, what role Mark Carney played in getting here, and why, even though this vote is largely symbolic, it signals something much bigger about the fractures forming inside the Republican coalition. Let's start with the facts. On Wednesday, February 11th, 2026, the House of Representatives passed a resolution to terminate the national emergency that Trump used to impose tariffs on Canadian imports. The final vote was 219 to 211. 6 Republicans, Don Bacon of Nebraska, Kevin Kiley of California, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Jeff Hurd of Colorado, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Dan Newhouse of Washington, joined nearly every Democrat in voting yes. Only one Democrat, Jared Golden of Maine, voted against it. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere. House Speaker Mike Johnson had been trying to prevent this vote from ever happening. He engineered a procedural rule change that would have blocked the chamber from voting on any tariff resolutions until the summer, but on Tuesday night, that strategy collapsed when 3 Republicans, Massie, Kiley, and Bacon, voted against the rule, which meant the Democratic resolution could actually reach the floor. Don Bacon was blunt about why. He said on X, "Congress needs to be able to debate on tariffs. Article 1 of the Constitution places authority over taxes and tariffs with Congress for a reason. But for too long, we have handed that authority to the executive branch." Massie put it even more directly. When someone posted that congressional approval should be required to raise tariffs, Massie replied, "The Constitution requires it." This wasn't the first time the Senate had already voted on this issue. Back in October 2025, 4 Republican senators, Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski, joined all Democrats to pass a similar measure by a vote of 50 to 46. Those same 4 voted for it again when it came back around, so the Senate and House have now both gone on record opposing Trump's Canada tariffs. But here's the critical caveat, and this is where you need to understand the difference between a symbolic rebuke and an actual policy change. Even though both chambers have now passed resolutions, the House vote did not reach the 2/3 majority needed to override a presidential veto. And Trump will almost certainly veto it. Speaker Johnson, after the vote, called it a fruitless exercise and a pointless effort, noting that the president's veto power makes it moot in practical terms, so the tariffs remain in place. But the political damage is real. Let's talk about what these tariffs actually look like right now, because the numbers matter. Trump first imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods back in February 2025, using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and declaring a national emergency over fentanyl at the border. Since then, the tariffs have escalated. In August 2025, he raised them to 35% on many categories. Canadian imports like steel, aluminum, and copper currently face a 35% tariff. Non-American automobiles face a 25% duty. And just weeks ago, Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Canada went ahead with a trade agreement with China. According to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, Trump's tariff regime amounts to an average tax increase per American household of $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. That's not coming from the Canadian government. That's coming out of American wallets. And the lawmakers who voted against Trump this week know their constituents are feeling it. Jeff Hurd, one of the 6 Republicans who crossed the aisle, told CNN that farmers and steel manufacturers in his district have been directly impacted. He said, "At the end of the day, I looked at the Constitution, I looked at what was in the best interest of my district, and I took the vote." That calculation, district pain versus presidential loyalty, is the central tension driving this entire story. Now let's talk about the other side of this equation, Mark Carney, because what's happening in Ottawa is just as significant as what's happening in Washington. Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025 after Justin Trudeau resigned, and from day one, he's taken a fundamentally different approach to the Trump tariff threat than his predecessor. Where Trudeau often sought to de-escalate and avoid confrontation, Carney has leaned into strategic resistance. The pivotal moment came at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026. Carney delivered a speech that received a rare standing ovation. Without naming Trump directly, he declared that the old American-led economic order was experiencing a rupture. He warned that great powers were weaponizing economic tools like tariffs, and he delivered the line that set the tone for everything that followed. Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Trump didn't take it well. He rescinded Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace. Then he threatened 100% tariffs over a Canada-China trade agreement, a deal that Carney had struck to lower tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood, in exchange for allowing a capped number of Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. But here's what makes Carney's approach different. He didn't just respond with rhetoric. He's been systematically diversifying Canada's trade relationships. He boasted to Trump in a phone call that Canada had struck 12 new deals on 4 continents in 6 months. Canada has been actively redirecting supply chains away from total dependence on the United States. Carney has said Canada plans to double its non-U.S. exports over the next decade. When Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claimed on Fox News that Carney had aggressively walked back his Davos remarks during a call with Trump, Carney publicly denied it the next morning. His exact words, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos." This is not how Canadian prime ministers have traditionally dealt with American presidents. The traditional playbook was accommodation. Carney is running a different playbook, one built on reducing leverage rather than conceding to it. And the congressional votes against Trump's tariffs give that strategy additional political oxygen. So, where does this leave us? Let's be honest about what this vote does and doesn't accomplish. What it doesn't do, it doesn't end the tariffs. Trump will veto the resolution. There aren't enough votes to override. The 35% tariff on Canadian steel, aluminum, and copper remains. The 25% auto tariff remains. The threat of 100% tariffs remains. In practical policy terms, nothing changes on Monday. What it does do, it forces every Republican in Congress to go on record. It creates a documented split between the president and members of his own party on his signature economic policy. And it opens the door for more votes. Democrats have successfully unlocked a procedural mechanism to force additional snap votes on Trump's tariffs against Mexico and his so-called Liberation Day tariffs in the coming weeks. The Supreme Court is also in play. Lower courts have already ruled against Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs, and the Supreme Court is set to hear arguments in the case. If the court limits the president's authority, the congressional votes become even more significant as evidence of legislative intent. Meanwhile, Carney is watching all of this and calibrating. His government announced plans to revamp Canada's tariff system to create stronger incentives for automakers to invest in Canada, directly resisting American efforts to lure factory jobs south. He's kept counter tariffs on U.S.-made cars and trucks, and he's launching consultations on an import credit scheme to help Canadian auto companies lower their tariff burden. This isn't a one-move chess game. It's a multi-year repositioning. Carney's strategy doesn't depend on a single congressional vote or a single court ruling. It depends on making Canada progressively less vulnerable to American economic pressure, regardless of who's in the White House. 3 things to watch going forward. First, Trump's retaliation against the Republicans who defied him. He's already threatened primary challengers. The question is whether he follows through and whether it deters others from crossing the aisle on future tariff votes. Don Bacon is retiring, so the threat doesn't touch him. But Hurd, Kiley, and Fitzpatrick are not. Their political futures may depend on whether voters in their districts care more about loyalty to Trump or the price of groceries. Second, the upcoming Senate vote on the House resolution. The Senate has already passed similar measures twice with the same 4 Republican defectors. If it passes again, Trump vetoes it, and the cycle continues. But each time, the political cost of maintaining the tariffs becomes more visible. Third, and this is the big one, the Supreme Court case. Multiple lower courts have ruled that Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs is illegal. If the Supreme Court agrees, it doesn't matter how many times Trump vetoes congressional resolutions. The legal foundation for the tariffs collapses. Here's what we know for certain. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship has entered territory we haven't seen in modern history. A $700 billion annual trade partnership, the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, is being tested by a president who views tariffs as leverage and a prime minister who's systematically trying to reduce that leverage. The tariffs are costing American households over $1,000 a year. Congressional Republicans are starting to feel the pressure from their districts. Canadian strategy is shifting from accommodation to diversification, and the courts are circling. Trump still holds the executive power, the tariffs remain in force, but for the first time, his own coalition is showing cracks on the issue that defines his economic agenda. And that's not something you can fix with a Truth Social post. I'll be tracking this closely as the Senate vote approaches and the Supreme Court case develops. If you want to stay on top of this story, subscribe. It's free, and it helps us keep covering the stories that actually affect your money. I'll see you in the next one.